Okay, so before continuing, today I'll be publishing the next lab text. What do you think it will be about? Bootstrap, obviously. So what we have done so far, but now using Bootstrap. And as I told you before, in the second half of the class, we will start talking about Flask. We won't finish today, but at least today I want to introduce some of the main concepts. Then we will deep on that on Monday, and on next Tuesday we will probably be doing some examples on that, okay? So first of all, today the idea is to understand what is Flask and where does it fit into the architecture we have always been seeing. Then I don't know if today, but for sure next Monday we will be installing and setting up Flask and making sure that it works on the development environment. Then we will create a basic Flask application and how to handle the roots. What do you think the roots might mean in this context? Do you have any clues on what a root might be? Have you seen that when you open a website, a web application, you do a request by means of the URL, right? So if you write polito.it and then /students, it will retrieve some website. But then if you write professors, it will retrieve a different website. So the roots basically refer to that specific location that retrieves a specific HTML. And then we will see how to integrate Flask with the pages or with the page that we have built so far, okay? So as usual, we always start with this architecture slide. Where are we? Are we still in the front end or did we switch to the back end? We switched to the back end, no? So all of the front end part had to do with Bootstrap, with CSS, and with how the final user interacts with our application. Now we are trying to see on the other side how it is built. In the real life, let's say that this Flask and what we are going to implement, usually not, for sure, will be running into a different computer. It will be running into a web server, no? And it is us, like the users, that from our computer will be accessing to that, or will be asking requests to that web server that is remote. In this case, of course, we will first make it work in our computer, all of it, the back end, the front end, and then at some point of the course, we will do the deployment. So that by doing the deployment, you will see that that part, the back end part, doesn't run in our computer, but it runs into a remote computer, okay? So here, do you remember what Flask was? Did I told you something about Flask? It is a framework for creating a web server, basically. And it is built using Python. So we will be implementing the backend using Python. Okay, so the backend is the part of the web application that works behind the scenes in somehow. It is the one that handles the data logic and the server communication. But I think these concepts are pretty clear for you. So when we specifically refer to a server, yeah.
Is it just like Apache or is it different thing?
No, it is different. It is different. Yeah, because Apache is another web server, and here instead of that is Flask that basically builds the server behind and retrieves. It's a different one. On that technology stack, it's a different one. It's an alternative. Yeah. Okay, and I was saying about a server. What is basically a server? It is still a computer just that it is a computer that is specialized for a given task. Okay, so in this case we can have different kind of servers. We can have servers that retrieve images. We can have servers that retrieve database queries. We can have servers that retrieve services. And there is a specific or one particular kind of server that is the one that we are going to implement here or replicate here, that is a web server. That, as its name says, it's a server specialized in retrieving pages after the request that the users send to them. Okay, so it is a specific computer that has been specialized to receive requests and to retrieve pages. In our case, don't forget that in our architecture, this server is an intermediary between the users or the front end and the database. Okay. Which kind of requests do the users will be asking to our server in this case, if we are talking about websites and web applications? HTTP requests. And this is a standard. All of the requests that are done to the web or through the web, it's an HTTP request. This is a protocol and all of the sites works like this. What is an HTTP request practically, or how do we understand an HTTP request? It's a request that we start usually from the browser by writing the URL in here, and from there it is the browser who starts the request towards the server. Okay, it looks something like this. It arrives to the HTTP server or to the web server. It's the same. And what are we expecting to get back from the server? A response that consists of if I send it polito.it, what I'm expecting to get into my browser? The HTTP response, that is the page at the end. The web application that we know that in web applications and in web pages is an HTML. No? So as you can see here, it gets the response with a lot of metadata concerning what it is sending back, and then it has HTML. No? And HTML means the page or the site that we have building so far. Okay, so Python by itself, the programming language, has also like a module that is called simple HTTP server to create a basic web server, but it is not so friendly and not so easy to use, and that's why instead of using like the default module that Flask that Python gives us, we will use Flask, that is a framework that is super easy to use and that is super easy to use. So it is a lightweight and flexible web framework for Python. It is simple and minimal, and that's the website. Okay, so before dipping into the technical aspects of Flask, I would like we to reflect how the web application is working right now. No? So up to now, we know how to create the HTML pages, and we know how to format them. Okay? If we want to open our pages, what are we doing now? If we want to see how the pages work and how to visualize them, what are we doing now in our computer? We basically open the HTML, okay? But opening the HTML is the same as opening a doc file or opening an Excel or opening any other file that is just in our computer, okay? So up to this point, it is not a web application. It is a file that is locally in our computer and we are opening it. That's all. What are we trying to implement? We are trying to implement something like, I do a request, I open the browser, in the browser I write an URL, that URL sends a request, and then is the web server, a remote web server, that retrieves me back the website that I want to see, okay? So in this case, it's a completely different schema or a completely different paradigm, okay? In this case, it's not anymore we that want to open our local files in our computer, but it's us that are doing a request to a remote server that will retrieve the files that we need to see. That is how a web application works. So with Flask, we have the opportunity to to handle the HTTP requests, which means when a user sends me a request with this URL, I will retrieve him this or that, okay? To define the routes that are that specific URLs, and to define how we will manage those requests. To render the templates for dynamic content. What do you think dynamic content means in this case? Up to now, are we doing something dynamic in our websites or in the HTML pages we are building? No, because they are always static, no? So every time we open the HTML, we see the same content in there. Do the websites in the real life work like that? No, they usually work that depending on the user, depending on the request that you make, depending on different aspects, it changes the HTML. So for instance, if you log in, then you expect to see in the page your photo and your name, for instance. Or if you, well, I don't know. Now all of the pages are different. If you apply a filter, you are expecting to see a different website. So the websites and the web pages are dynamic. And up to now, our sites are static. Then we will see how to manage the sessions and the user data. And finally, we'll see how to integrate with the databases. Okay. Why do we need to integrate with the database? Every
user has different data to retrieve from the database.
Yeah, because basically we are getting all of the data and all of the information is stored somewhere, no? So if we want, for instance, our users to be able to create an account, we are going to save the user information in the database. If we want the user to make a reservation, where are we going to save that reservation? Into a database. If we want the user to create a profile, write a review, do something else, everything is saved in the database. So at the end, once again, the web server is an intermediary between the front end and the database. Okay, so let's start to set up the environment to work with Flask. So first of all, you should check in your computer that you have Python installed. So I suppose everyone has Python. Anyway, if you want to check, this is the command. In some cases, it is just Python / version, and in some other cases, it installs Python under the alias of Python 3. So you can check both of them, and after running one of them, it should show like the version, and you immediately understand if it is installed. Okay, so the first step is to check if you have Python. If you don't, then you should open this website and download the latest version. Okay, we don't have any specific versions here to make it work, so you download the last one. This should open an installer, and then you run the installer and it should work. After installing Python, once we are sure we have Python, we will install Flask. That is a Python package at this point. So how do you install Flask? By running this command, pip install Flask. The Flask with the uppercase, and boom, that's all. If this one doesn't work, try with pip 3, because sometimes with the Python 3 installation, it also names the pip, the package manager, as pip 3 instead of just pip. And then you install Flask. Are you trying to install it? Sure, it should be something like this. So in this case, since it was already installed, it says requirement already satisfied. And then what I told you before. So in my case, for instance, it doesn't work just with Python because it has been installed under Python 3 or with that alias. And then if I write Python 3.m, that I think stands for module, Flask version, and it shows me the Python version, the Flask version, and this other that is a package that we will use. So after trying to install Flask, make sure that it works, and well, I think any version is fine because what we're going to do is not a very complex or very specific, so with this version should be fine. Okay? And let's create the first Flask application. Okay, so this is how a super simple Flask application looks. So without already executing it, what do you think it does? Or how do you think it works? So we can see it has a function, no? From the syntax that you already know, the Python syntax, we can see it has a function defined. What is the function? Home. Okay, so we have a function that is called home. What does that function retrieves? This string that is hello Flask. Okay. So up to now here we can understand this is a function. Here on above the function we can see a decorator. Okay. And this decorator says app.root. What do you think this is, or what do you think this stands for? For the? Yeah, for the URL of the website, no? So the root of the website. So if I write like the URL of the website without specifying any root, then this is the function that will take responsibility of retrieving me something. Okay, this is basically how it works. I will define a function for each root that I want to provide to the user. So in this case, this is like the empty root, or like the home root, or the root of the website, and it will just retrieve hello Flask. And here, well, basically I'm importing Flask and I'm initializing the application with Flask. Okay, how do we run the application? So if the Python file is named @.py, we can run it with the command flask run. Okay, so the advice is always save the Python file or the main Flask application file as app.py. Okay, because Flask run will search for that specific file that is called app.py. Okay. Otherwise, if you want to save it with a different name, you can do, for instance, like this, where main is the name of the file. For instance, if you don't want to call the application app.py, but my application .py, in that case it would be Flask dashes app my application run. Okay, but otherwise, if we just save the application as app.py, we just have to write Flask run. What will happen when we run the application? It will start a web server locally in our computer, and it will be accessible in this address by default. We can change that setup, but by default it will be this one. Okay. So, Bo, you try to run it and let me know if it works. Yeah.
I tried the Flask graph, but it asks for Flask app.
But does your file is named app.py?
Yeah.
And are you executing that from within? For instance, I'm executing the terminal. Do you know? I had to move to exercises and to the specific folder, because otherwise it can't find the file. So I have to execute this in the terminal from within this folder, let's say. First, I have to move to the folder where the Python file is and then execute the application. Okay? Worked? And when it runs, you will see a message like this. And when you click on the application, now it shows, opens the browser, and now here in the browser, we can see our hello Flask message. No? Does it work for everyone? What happens if I change this message? And now in the browser, when I get to that specific, no, it doesn't happen anything because I have to restart the server. So I stopped it, and then when I restarted the server, I can see that it changed. However, well, let me see something. Anyway, as you can imagine, having to restart the server for each change that is done is super boring and super complex. So when you run Flask, you should add also this flag, that is --debug, so that each change that you do on the files will immediately reflect on the website without having to restart the server each time that you make a modification. Okay? So for instance, now when I run with the debug, with the debug flag opened, and I save the application, and I update it, it should work. Okay? Fine, so what do you think should happen if I modify this route? If instead of leaving it this way, I write, for instance, here, hello. What should happen on the browser? Not found. Because there is not a function that satisfies or that takes responsibility of how to retrieve that specific route or what to do when that specific route is called or that route is tried to be accessed by the user. Okay? So this is just to give an example of how the routes would work. So here, instead of hello, I leave it like this. I can say that the root of the website will retrieve this message. Does the name of this function has always to be home? No. I can set the name to whatever I want. And it would still work. Okay? The only thing is that to each specific function, I have to add the decorator to indicate what is the root that is associated or linked with that specific function, nothing else. Up to now, questions? Does it work for you? Okay. Okay, so let's try to make sense more seriously of what everything means. So the Flask class is used to define the app instance and handle the incoming requests. Then the root, as I told you, is a decorator, and it's a function that modifies the behavior of another function or method. So in this case, it's something that adds a functionality to a simple function as it is home. So it is not just to call that function, but that when the root is set to that specific string, then the function is invoked or the function retrieves something. And basically the way that it creates a root for the homepage URL and it triggers the home function. So up to now it is pretty easy. So each time we will want to define a root, we will have to create a decorator and a function associated with the root. That's all. So here, when it retrieved this message, what did it retrieve? Did it retrieve just a string? I mean, we see just a string, but at the end, if it is being shown in the web browser, it's because it retrieved an HTML, no? So that if here we inspect this, we can see that it retrieved this super simple HTML. So the response that Flask gives to our requests is always an HTML. In this case, it's a super basic one, just with one message in the body. Okay. So from that point of view, what do we want with our web application? We would like that when we do different kinds of requests pointing to different routes, it retrieves a different HTML. No? So for instance, up to now, we have been working on the landing page or in the home of our website. So in that case, we would copy the HTML that we have been working so far. So copy paste the HTML into the Flask application, so that when a user asks for the home page, we will retrieve the HTML we have been working on. No? That would be the sense, the conceptual sense of how Flask should work. It should retrieve an HTML depending on each route that the user calls. So that if, for instance, in our website, the users go to the route about, then we will retrieve the HTML that we had built for about. Okay? Of course, doing it this way would be awful, because it would be like mixing up Python with HTML and retrieving the HTML, but as a string. You know what I mean? So basically by doing something like this. So declaring all of the HTML within the Python file. That is something that we, of course, don't want to do. Instead of this, which option do we have? This one, that is the function that we will be always using, that is render template. How does it work? Well, I think we all can infer from here how does it work. It renders an HTML file and retrieves the HTML file. Let's see. There is just one condition for doing this. And the condition is that the files should be in a folder, in a subfolder, that should be named exactly like this. In this case, it is important the name. It should be called templates, okay? Because Flask knows that in templates it will find the files that it will retrieve and render the templates. So, Paul, let's check if we can make it work with the things we have so far. So here in my folder, I have the app.py file. I will create a new folder that should be called templates, exactly like that. Important here, to use the render template function, you must import it here in the declaration. So from Flask, we will use the Flask instance itself, that is the one that you use here to initialize and instantiate the application. And we will also import the render template function, that is the one that we will use in here. Okay, so super simple, but up to now we are doing something more similar to how a real web application behaves. So that if I write something here, if I'm in the root, so I'm in the empty root, empty URL, it will retrieve me what I defined in the home function, okay? What if I want to create another root? So what did I do here? I created another root that will be under this URL about, and it is linked to this function that I also decided to call about. Once again, I'm not forced to call this function about because the root is named about. I can set any name to this function, any name that I want. The way this decorator is linked to this function is because it is the decorator and it is in the line above. So you don't have to make the names to match. And once again, I decided to call the HTML file about, but this HTML could be named however I want, okay? As an advice, let's try to keep everything organized so that if you call this function, this URL user, that you don't call the function about and then you call the index, the page home, no? Because it would be a mess to understand exactly what you are doing or what this function and this root is representing. But other than that, technically it should work, okay? It will work. So now how do we test if everything is worked? Because now here in the root, in the URL, I write about, that is the other function that I defined. Let me check. About. Ah, okay. Yeah, it worked. So if here I was in the landing page or in the root without anything, it retrieved the index.html, and here it retrieves the about page. Okay? Does it work for you? Okay, so once again, this is the way we will never implement this. We will never write the HTML directly into the app.py, but we will always use render template. Okay, let's try in these 20 minutes that we still have. Let's try not to implement this, but to make sense of these snippets, for instance. So let's take a look at them and let's try to understand how they are working. Up to now, we are basically retrieving a static website, no? So that each time that the user goes to that specific route, I'm retrieving index.html, that is a static HTML. What do you think is happening here? So on the Python side, I'm basically declaring this array with three strings. That is something that we can do in Python. So this is regular Python, okay? And then in the render template, I'm doing the things as usual. I mean the index.html, but then I am passing a second parameter, okay? And this parameter corresponds to the list I have just declared. No? So I'm passing these items as a parameter to the render template function. This on the app.py. Then on the index.html, what I'm doing differently. So up to now, with what we have seen about HTML, we have never seen this kind of syntax, no? This syntax is new. So here, the UL and the UL, they are still HTML. But here, with the curly brackets and the percentage, what are we doing somehow? Like embedding some code there. And, well, as you can infer, it is for each item that I have received in these P items or in this parameter that was passed to me as P items, I want to print or to print a list HTML element in which I want to show the item or to print the item in there, okay? And then I end the for. So this is a syntax that enables me to add an statement, an expression within the index.html. So I don't know if you now can identify why our HTML files now became a template. No, they are not anymore static HTML files, but they will work as a template in which we will embed the information that we will get from somewhere else. In this case, this information or this data that we are passing is data that we are inventing here and passing it to the HTML. But in a more realistic scenario or in a future scenario, the data will come from the database. So we will retrieve something for the database and we will build this HTML basically with the data that we have got from the database. Okay. So in here, for instance, we see how the loops worked with this syntax. In this case, what are we seeing? The conditionals, no? So if I'm passing, for instance, here as a parameter, the name John or the string John. So if I, for instance, receive something attached to this user parameter, then I will print welcome and the username that I received. Otherwise, I would say welcome guest. Okay? That it has something to do with what you have been asking. How do in the website are we going to show? How can we manage to show a link if the user is logged in and hide that link if the user is not logged in? Or if we want to, well, yeah, in the website description, in the one we have been working today, we could add a message, welcome, and the specific name of the user based on the information that we retrieved from the backend and the database. Up to now, are we clear what we are trying to build and how it works? Do you have any questions? Nice. So I think that we can stop here for today, so that we can deep on the Flask aspects next lesson. The lab will be about Bootstrap, so you should be fine for the lab. Yeah, so let's stop here and see you on Friday. Certo.